It's kind of like if the movies Rain Man and Little Miss Sunshine had a baby, and that movie baby was a huge Trekkie. That's right, today we're going to be talking about the 2018 indie road trip movie, Please Stand By. This movie is directed by Ben Lewin and is written by Michael Galampo, adapted from his stage play, and starring Dakota Fanning as Wendy, Toni Collette as Scotty, and Alice Eve as Audrey. Please Stand By is rated PG-13 for brief language. So the first two categories of my grid both involve writing. The first category is going to be plot and genre. So overall, I thought the plot structure was fairly solid. There weren't really any plot holes, but there were definitely some contrivances and some conveniences. And then there were just things like Scotty didn't know anything about Star Trek, like anything. It seems like she would, maybe try to educate herself about it, especially because throughout the course of the movie, we see that her son likes Star Trek, or at least knows the answers to some of these questions, and she seems to have kind of a strained relationship to him, so why would she not talk to him about it and be like, hey, why don't we sit down and watch some Star Trek? You can teach me about it. It just seemed very apathetic that she wouldn't try to educate herself more on this topic that Wendy cared so much about. So things like that aren't necessarily plot holes, but just made me kind of take a step back and be like, really? And then also the plot was just very predictable. It was more of a character study movie, so I think it can get away with being a little bit more predictable. And it was definitely driven by the outer goal of the protagonist, in this case Wendy. The whole premise of the movie is that she wants to get this script that she's written mailed in time to be considered for this contest. So it's definitely, as far as plot goes, it definitely got points for having a very clear outer goal that drove the plot forward. Although part of what made it so predictable was that it did have all of those beats of, trying to get somewhere in time and having obstacles come up. So it's a little bit of a give and take. It lost points for being predictable, but got points for having that clear outer goal. So one last thing I'll say within the plot and genre section is going to be that I thought, despite the script being fairly predictable, I thought it did a pretty good job of subverting a lot of the usual tropes. For example, there's a scene where she's when she's at the hospital and she wants to escape and she sees the window. It's like, all right, we're going to have this classic beat. She's going to escape out the window and run away. It felt very, leading into that scene, it was like, all right, I know where this is going. Let's just get on with it kind of thing. But then we see kind of her cleverness when she hides under the sink and then escapes just out the door. So I thought that was a nice way of not just subverting tropes and giving us a different take on a familiar scene, but also showing us a lot about this character that, she also, she knows the tropes. She knows that they're going to assume she went out the window, and she's going to, turn that around on them and do things her own way. And I just thought it did a good job of subverting tropes like that throughout the movie, even though in the end it was still a very predictable movie. So overall, for the writing, plot, and genre category, I gave Please Stand By a 7.1, which I consider to be solidly good. So the next category of the grid is going to be characters. I think the first thing to talk about when talking about Please Stand By is going to be Wendy's autism. They never use the word autism throughout the script, but it's pretty clear through her behavior and her interactions with people that she's on the spectrum. I'm not on the spectrum, and I don't know anybody on the spectrum, so I wanted to just see what other people were saying about, the accuracy of the portrayal, and it seems pretty 50-50. A lot of people are saying that, it just misses the mark. It's another example, similar to Rain Man, where it's, just very, very cliche, very stereotypical, very unrealistic. About another 50% of people are saying that it's pretty well done. Nobody's saying it's perfect, that I saw at least, but there are definitely people who seem to be responding pretty well to it and saying that it's a fairly accurate portrayal. I thought it did a pretty good job with room for improvement. So I thought one of the weakest aspects within the character portion of the script is going to come with the dialogue. When it worked, it really worked, and when it didn't, it stood out like a sore thumb. It really felt like the three main characters of Wendy, Scotty, and Audrey had pretty solid dialogue, whereas pretty much all of the other characters were pretty flat and pretty not great. Because Galampo did adapt his own play into a screenplay, I'm not sure if he added a lot of characters that weren't in the play. I'm not sure what it was, but it was definitely, the secondary characters just didn't have great dialogue, and it was noticeable. I did feel like the character arcs throughout were also a little bit flat, particularly with Wendy. It just didn't feel as much like a personal growth kind of story as it was just showing other people that she was, capable of it all along, which is still good. That's still a story worth telling, but I would have liked to see just a little bit more personal growth as opposed to, showing everybody what she already knew she could do kind of thing. I felt like there was a lot of potential there. So I gave the character portion of the script a total of 6.8 out of 10, which is still pretty solidly good. It's definitely above average, not going into that great range, just right down the middle, good. So the next category in the grid is going to be acting and casting. And I thought Dakota Fanning did a really amazing job, as did Toni Collette. I think they're both pretty much good in everything they're in, but they definitely brought solid performances to this movie. Alice Eve was pretty good as Audrey too, but I just didn't feel like it had the same resonance that either Collette or Fanning had. So that was a little bit disappointing. Part of that could be the script, just the way the character was written, I'm not sure. But I definitely just didn't quite feel the same way about that character as I did about either Scotty or Wendy. And I also thought, I mentioned this a little bit with the dialogue as well, but with some of the secondary characters, I felt like the lines, they weren't written well, which is probably why, but the deliveries themselves fell flat as well, and it just wasn't as strong as I would have liked to see. So I did feel like some of the secondary characters were not so great. I did really like Tony Revolori as Nemo. I thought he was a nice presence in there, and I liked that they didn't, force a love story or, make that too much of a, flirty or romantic kind of relationship, but it was just a sweet kind of friendship that they had there. So I liked his character. I thought he did a good job. And River Alexander, who played Scotty's son Sam, he was okay. I felt like he was a lot stronger in some scenes than others, and so I was just kind of left with mixed feelings on his performance. But I thought he was fine. He was okay. Now, on one last note with the acting and casting category, I just want to go back to talking about Dakota Fanning for just a sec, just because I really did think she did a pretty phenomenal performance. She has a couple of scenes with children or babies that I thought were just really sweet. Her connection with her niece, who she's never met, is a big driving force of the plot, particularly her emotional needs throughout the movie. So when they finally meet at the end, I thought that was just a really well acted scene. And then there's a scene on the bus where the little girl sees her dog and she tells her shh, and I thought that was really sweet and just showed that she, even though she's not, she has autism and human connections can be difficult, that she still had this kind of innate connection with children and wanted to be around kids because she wanted to have that relationship with her niece. I don't know that it's going to be a career highlight. She definitely already has some very strong performances under her belt, and I think she's likely to have, even more strong performances in the future if she chooses to continue acting. So I definitely, don't think this is going to be a career highlight, but it's still a really good performance. So I gave the total score for the acting and casting category a 7.4 out of 10. So the next category is going to be lighting. And I don't have a ton to talk about with the lighting of this movie. Nothing looks cheap or ugly or anything like that. So there's definitely nothing bad about the lighting of the movie, but it didn't really contribute to the storytelling too much. The mood a little bit more, but still not, didn't have a huge impact. There were a few scenes here and there, particularly the scene towards the end of the movie where we see Kirk and Spock, and then they take off their helmets, and it's Wendy and Audrey, which I thought was a really nice scene, and the cinematography there for sure. It definitely did a good job of blending what we've, come to associate throughout the movie with as Star Trek. We see her script, we see this very familiar landscape, and then at the end it's kind of goes from that to a very emotional, very personal scene, and it's got the very magic hour, warm kind of lighting, which definitely helps with the emotion. So that's one example of a scene where, the lighting definitely helped with both the mood and the storytelling. But aside from those scenes, everything was pretty much just shot in a realistic kind of way, which isn't a bad thing. It made sense within the world of the movie, but I still feel like even within natural, lighting, you can still have a little bit more mood or ambiance or, storytelling devices. You can still bring that into a very realistic movie, and I just didn't feel like this did that too much. So it looked really good, and there were a few scenes here and there that stood out, but overall it was pretty average, with those few points that I talked about earlier kind of knocking it up a little bit above average. So the lighting overall, I gave a 6.7 out of 10, with a 5.0 being average and an 8 being great. So it's definitely solidly good. So the next category in the grid is going to be camera work. I thought the camera work throughout the movie was pretty solid. Similar to lighting, nothing really stood out as being, overly awesome or, really, different or, artistic or emotional. It was all very, pretty standard shot, reverse shot kind of stuff. There were a few things like, a Dutch angle thrown in here or there to kind of show, I think the first time when she gets off the bus in LA, we see that little bit of a Dutch angle, which kind of helps put us in her headspace of being, a little off kilter and a little discombobulated, being in a new city, and, particularly for her, because she's never, even been to the other side of Market Street. It's definitely, your world gets shifted a little. It's a little confusing. So I thought that, it's definitely a common technique, but it was effective. So there were things like that I thought it did really well with. And the compositions were all nice. Nothing that really stood out as, oh yeah, that shot, that was really good. It was all pretty standard, classic Hollywood type shots, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It just, didn't get any extra points for doing anything particularly noteworthy. So overall, the camera work got a 7.1 out of 10, solidly good. So next category in the grid is going to be editing and special effects. I thought the editing overall was actually really good. There were things like jump cuts thrown in here and there with enough consistency that it didn't feel out of place, but not overused to the point of being obnoxious. One scene that stands out is when she's escaping the hospital and she's going down the stairs, and we get a few jump cuts. And it's also edited, at least a little bit in time with the music, so you get, kind of jump cuts to the beat, which I thought did a really good job of keeping the momentum fresh, and also just kind of speeding along the process. And so I just thought things like that were just well done. Nothing super revolutionary or anything, nothing that really stands out, but definitely, it was well done. It was a well-edited movie. I also thought that editing really contributed to the pace of the movie. Like I said, there were scenes with jump cuts that kind of helped move the pace along. And then you have longer scenes that are, a lot more emotional, that are, the editor allowed to be drawn out a little bit more. Scenes like Audrey watching the home videos, or, when Wendy has her tantrum, they were calling it, where she, gets upset that she can't go back home. So scenes like that were allowed to be kind of drawn out. I didn't feel like they had too many cuts, and just really let the emotions come through, which I think, of course it was there in the script, but the editing really allowed for those emotions to come through in a much more well-rounded way, which I just thought was really well done. The editor seemed to know when to cut and when to let the shot go. So the editing overall, I gave a 7.3 out of 10, which again is going to be solidly good, getting closer to that great mark, which starts at an 8.0 out of 10 for me, but, still solidly good. So the next category is going to be sound, which is going to include the overall sound mix and sound effects, as well as music throughout the movie. Pretty much anything you hear goes into this category. But I think for this movie, one of the biggest things to talk about is going to be the soundtrack. It's definitely the Shins song away from being, a very, very cliche indie movie twee soundtrack, but I really liked it, so I'm not gonna lie. I definitely thought it was a really fun, upbeat soundtrack. I thought it really helped just get that kind of road trip, adventure kind of feeling. And yeah, it was definitely, you listen to the soundtrack, it's like, that came from an indie movie, didn't it? Like, it definitely had that, typical indie movie soundtrack vibe, but I really liked it. As far as everything else within the sound, again, it was well done. Nothing stood out as being awful, nothing pushed it into the awesome range. So I gave the sound category overall a 7.5 out of 10, which is going to be good. So the next category in the grid is going to be aesthetics. This is going to cover character aesthetics, which includes hair, makeup, and costumes, as well as environmental aesthetics, which is going to be sets, props, and locations. So as far as hair and makeup go, I thought this movie did a pretty good job of feeling pretty realistic as far as, the journey she's going through and what she's going to look like from start to end. Not that she's totally disheveled by the end or anything, but she's also not, perfectly made up either. I also liked the costumes throughout the movie, particularly with Dakota Fanning's character. I definitely like that she had a style, and we see in the beginning she's got a different shirt for each day, and by the end of the movie she's wearing a shirt that wasn't in that rotation. So I thought that was a nice subtle way of kind of showing her character growth. I also really loved the sets and locations throughout the movie. I mean, obviously it's a road trip movie. She starts in one place and ends up in another, but the two cities that they chose, San Francisco and Los Angeles, couldn't be more different from each other. So, she starts in one landscape, ends in another. The architecture is different. The citizens around her are different. I mean, just everything about those two cities can't get much more different. So I thought that the choice of those locations was really good. And then I also loved the Star Trek landscape that we see in the few scenes when we see her screenplay, and we see the vast desert and the two astronauts walking through it. It really felt like classic Trek. I mean, it had that famous rock formation. I can't recall the name of it right now, but it's been used in a lot of stuff, including Star Trek. And I thought in a lot of ways those scenes felt so much more like classic Trek than even the J.J. Abrams Trek movies. And that's not to say that one is better than the other. They're, apples and oranges. But I thought Please Stand By did a really good job. You could tell the budget and the lighting and all that was much, much higher than the Star Trek original series, and it was definitely, you get very wide shots, felt very cinematic. So I just thought that it did a good job of feeling like a modern movie while also feeling like Star Trek. And also within the props of the movie, I love that we see just all these little, Star Trek props. I mean, she had her backpack that had the Star Trek insignia on it. Of course, her dog Pete was, wearing a Star Trek uniform, things like that. But then you also have just little things in the background. There's one scene where she's in her bedroom and there you can see a fan in the background, and there's the Star Trek insignia on it. So things like that. It's just full of little Easter eggs. So I thought that was pretty cool also. So the total score for the aesthetics is going to be an 8.1 out of 10, which I consider to be great. I'd mentioned with the lighting that I wish it had done more to, kind of play into the storytelling and setting the mood, things like that. But I definitely think that this movie kind of compensated for that lack within the aesthetics. So the next category in the grid is going to be impact on film. Please Stand By is not doing super great, largely because nobody's really talking about this movie. I think it's a combination of it wasn't marketed a lot. I'm pretty sure I saw a trailer for it on my Facebook feed, and if I hadn't seen it there, I would not have heard of this movie. So that's definitely a factor. And I feel like just because of the subject matter, I think a lot of people either think it's going to be too nerdy if they're not a Star Trek fan, or if someone's not on the spectrum or doesn't know someone on the spectrum, maybe they just don't have much interest, which I think is ridiculous. That if you're not interested in other people's ways of life, what's the point of going to the movies? Like, if you just want to see people like yourself, So yeah, it's just kind of a shame that nobody's seeing it or talking about it. In any case, for the critical impact, I gave Please Stand By a 2.5 out of 10. So as of the recording of this review, the tomato meter score for Please Stand By is a 56% with an average rating of 5.7 out of 10. So normally when a movie has about a 50% on Rotten Tomatoes, it's usually a love it or hate it kind of movie. People either giving it very low scores or very high scores. And this seems to be one of the exceptions where pretty much everybody's just giving it average scores. So for that reason, instead of giving it a 5 out of 10, I kind of cut it in half and just gave it a 2.5 out of 10. Which is definitely very low, but with a movie like this where pretty much everybody is declaring that it's mediocre, that's not a great reception. So even though there's only, I believe, 24 reviews on Rotten Tomatoes, it's not like we have a huge collection of scores to average out here, so I think that that's a little bit unfair as well. But like I said, nobody's really seen this movie, nobody's really talking about it. It's been out for 3 weeks, I think, already. So I don't really see it getting a ton more reviews in the future. So yeah, all of those reasons kind of contribute to why I gave it such a low score for the critic rating. So the next score is going to be the audience/cult impact. And I really don't see this movie having much of a cult impact. The audience reception really isn't too much better than the critical reception. As I said, there are 268 reviews, audience reviews on Rotten Tomatoes right now, with an average rating of 4 out of 5, and the audience score is going to be a 71%. There's still just not a lot of people seeing it, which I think is going to be this movie's biggest issue over time. I think it's pretty much just going to be an obscure little movie that not a lot of people see. Again, I halved the audience score for that reason and gave it a 3.5 out of 10. And then for the historical and inspirational impacts, I probably should have given it a 0 out of 10, but I went with the benefit of the doubt and gave it a 1 out of 10. If nothing else, my hope with this movie is that it will open the door to autistic filmmakers. It would be nice to see autistic people writing their own stories or being able to play the protagonist in a movie about an autistic person. Anytime you can have members of a community, regardless of the community, telling their own story, I think that's incredibly valuable, not just for that community, but for the world as a whole. I mean, like I said earlier, if you're not seeing movies about people other than yourselves, I mean, what's the point? I definitely get the appeal of watching a movie about someone like you, but when you're so oversaturated with that, it's time to give other people's stories a chance. And I think Wonder Woman is a good example of a movie that did that for women, where it was women filmmakers coming together, making a movie about a powerful woman. And I'd like to see more communities able to do that. I don't think there's a lack of a desire for this, either from audiences or, in this case, autistic people. I think people want to tell their story, and it's just a matter of finding an outlet for them and getting studios to fund these movies and distribute these movies, and just having faith that people want to hear these stories, because they do. And yeah, sure, it's probably not going to be a multi-million-dollar blockbuster, but not every movie has to be. So that's just kind of my spiel on that, and that's why I didn't give it a 0, because I do hope that this movie is going to kind of inspire people to want to tell more stories like this, ideally from a more authentic point of view and a more personal point of view. So the total score for impact on film is going to be a 2.33 out of 10, which I do consider to be a pretty bad rating. I think the reason that that score is so low is because this movie just was not marketed, and therefore nobody is seeing it. So the last category in my grid is going to be overall enjoyment. And I gave Please Stand By a 7 out of 10. So it's definitely not, it's not a movie I walked away from saying, that was the best movie ever. But I definitely did enjoy it, and it's definitely, it's one that I would recommend to people. It's worth seeing, even though it's not the best movie ever. Maybe just put it a little lower on your list if you've got others you want to see. So that's kind of my take on the movie overall, but I thought it was good. So 7 out of 10, good. Please Stand By also got 1 point of extra credit. I gave it a half point just for all of the Star Trek references. I know it's inherent in the premise of the movie, but I love Star Trek, and I thought it was great to see a character who loves Star Trek as well, and just to see the reasons why she related to it and why she loved it. And so I thought that aspect of the script was really good, and especially because it's well documented that since Star Trek first came out, people on the spectrum, obviously not universally, but a lot of people on the spectrum relate to Spock. It was just very cool that they were able to make that connection and just explore the idea of fandom in that way. Even though it wasn't the central focus of the movie, it was a little bit more in the background. But yeah, so I just loved that aspect of the script. And then also, like I mentioned, with the props, just all of the little Easter eggs that we get in the background. And then you even get, you get the Klingon exchange between Officer Frank and Wendy, which was fun, even though it was in the trailer, which kind of ruined it. But, there's just all kinds of little, references, the kazoo that makes the Star Trek hailing sound, over and over again, all kinds of just fun little Star Trek references. So I definitely gave it a half point there for that. And then I gave it another half point just because it is telling a story about someone who is autistic, and even if it's not the most authentic portrayal, they're trying, and it's a step forward for Hollywood, I think, and hopefully it will, be one step closer to that end goal of having everybody essentially be able to have the chance to tell their story. That should be the end goal for any art form. Everybody deserves to have a voice and to have the ability to tell their own story. And obviously not everybody born is going to be a natural storyteller or natural filmmaker, but you can still work in collaboration with people. There are other ways to get your story out there, and if we can open doors for people that have the talent and the desire to make films, those doors need to be open to those people. So I'm hoping that this movie is going to be a step in the right direction. This movie shouldn't be the end goal for portrayals of people on the spectrum, but it's a step forward and a step in the right direction. So I gave it a half point of extra credit for that. So the total score for Please Stand By is going to be 68.33, which, like pretty much everything throughout the grid, is solidly good. It's a movie I would recommend to people. It's definitely fun and it's sweet. It's an easy watch. It's not, not something that's gonna stick with you for long amounts of time, for better or worse, but it's still, it's fun and it's sweet, and it gives us a perspective on life that we don't normally get in films, by having a main character who is autistic, and the portrayal is fairly well done. It might be a little bit too twee or too feel good for some people, and it's definitely predictable as far as the plot goes. So if that kind of thing bothers you, this probably isn't the movie for you. But if you like feel good movies, if you want to just be able to sit back and enjoy a movie for an hour and a half, I would recommend this one. I think it's worth seeing, and I think it's a shame that it wasn't marketed a little bit better, and that it's not, that people aren't seeing it and talking about it. Not the greatest movie ever made, but it's worth seeing, and it doesn't deserve to just fall into the netherworld or what have you. So that's my recommendation. I hope you enjoyed this review, and I look forward to seeing you next time. I'll be back next week talking about Black Panther. See you then! Hey, thanks for watching. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you liked what you saw, don't forget to subscribe to Griddy Films on YouTube by pressing this button. Also, like and share this video. You can follow Griddy Films on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram for new video announcements, entertainment news, fun pics, and more. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.